Midnight Children, Dan Gemeinhart. So this is one of the book award winners in Georgia. And I have to give the warning before I read this that there's some graphic scenes about the slaughterhouse. And so after you hear the story, you may not want to ever eat beef again. But I chose this book to read. It is one of the book award winners, and the competition, Reading Bowl competitions, and other competitions that they have usually choose these books to be part of their Reading Bowl competitions. And so I want all students to have access to these books, so I chose this one. But I don't know if I would want my kid reading this because they're probably not going to want to eat meat after this. But it is a really good story. Midnight Children. Okay. For all the souls that I call family, whether by blood or by choosing, and for all those souls still finding theirs. Part 1. Chapter 1, in which a wish is not spoken and a secret is kept. Nearly all of Slaughterville was sleeping when the children came. There was no sign welcoming visitors to Slaughterville because most of the town's visitors were cows, and none of them were particularly happy to be there. They were even less happy when they left. But on this particular night, there were visitors. They arrived quietly, fingers crossed that they would not be noticed. And for most of the part, they weren't. The town was dark, except for the silver of the moonlight. In the little block of buildings on Skinnister Street that Slaughterville called downtown, the sheriff was in her office. Excuse me. But her feet were up on her desk, her head thrown back, eyes closed and mouth open, dreaming along to the opera music soaring from the record player spinning beside her. Next door, Mr. Chin, the baker, was awake. He could have seen the children pass by, but he was bent over sliding yet another great round sourdough loaf into the oven and missed them. Just. All the other shops and stores stood dark and empty. The bell watched silently from the church tower at the end of the block as the children rolled through town on Skinnister Street and out the other side. The windowless slaughterhouse that gave the town its name was still, its machinery quiet, its blades idle but waiting, the killing floor hose clean and empty. Moonlight glinted on the steely points of the dangling meat hooks. Cows dozed behind the fences in the muddy stock pens, not wondering even a little bit about what awaited them the next day, which was probably for the best. Just past the slaughterhouse, the truck clattered over the narrow bridge that crossed Caracas Creek. It took the first left turn after crossing the bridge, its headlights flashing for a second on a tilting sign marking Offal Road. There were only 2 houses on Offal Road before it dead-ended into the woods. Both of them were dark, and only one of them had held living souls. The house on the left was empty, at least for the moment, and across the street in the house on the right, on the second story, a boy lay in bed. All around his window, which looked out on the street, were birdhouses. Dozens of them, all shapes and sizes and colors. The boy had made them all. The boy is the hero of this story, or rather, one of the heroes. No one would have been more surprised to hear that than the boy himself. He was about as far from a hero as anything he could imagine. Sometimes, though, a soul doesn't know how great it truly is until it has to find out. The boy's name was Ravini Foster. Ravini's mother and father were asleep, but he was not. He was staring at the ceiling and he was crying. He had been woken not by a sound or by a dream, but by a feeling. A feeling so strong that it jolted him out of the sleep and into darkness. The feeling that woke Ravini Foster on this moonlight night, it was loneliness. I don't know if you've ever been so lonely that it woke you up. I hope not. But isn't it interesting that this particular boy was woken on this particular night by that particular feeling when that exact truck was turning onto that exact road? It seems more than a coincidence. It seems almost like magic, perhaps. This boy, woken by loneliness, heard something, a low, growly sort of rumble. He wiped the tears off his cheeks, got out of bed, and crept on quiet feet over to the window and looked down on Awful Road. A large white truck was parked in front of the empty house across the street. Ravini rubbed his eyes, not quite believing them. The truck made no sense. No one had lived in that house since old Mr. Croward had broken his hip and moved to Iron Burr weeks before. And no one drove into Slaughterville at night because nothing happened in Slaughterville at night. But nevertheless, there it was. The engine kept rumbling as a large and lumpy man stepped down out of the cab. A fat cigar glowed between his lips. He looked up and down the street, puffing smoke like a dragon. Satisfied with the silence, the man walked around to the back of the truck, undid the latch, and with a rattling clatter rolled the door up and open. Then he stepped aside and leaned against the truck, eyes back on Skinnister Street. Upstairs, Ravini watched, waiting, and then slowly his mouth dropped open because out of the truck stepped children. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 children. The oldest, a dark-haired boy whose head swiveled to scan the moonlit street around them, looked to be 16 or 17 years old. The youngest, a yawning girl in a white dress, was only 5 or 6. The other 2 girls and 2 boys were somewhat in between. 6 children, stepping down into moonlight without making a sound. Each carried a suitcase. The youngest girl held a ragged stuffed giraffe in one hand, but they had no furniture, no lamps, no mattresses, no chairs. 6 children appearing out of nowhere, alone together. No, wait. As Ravini watched, one more child emerged from the blackness of the truck. A girl about his own age, 12 or 13. She stood for a moment in the back of the truck looking around at Awful Road. Her hair, which was tied back with black ribbon, looked silver in the moonlight. But Ravini thought that in sunlight it would look gold. She wore blue jeans and a white t-shirt. One hand held a suitcase, just like the other children, but the other held something else, a white umbrella, the lacy, pretty kind that fancy ladies carried at fancy events like horse races and country picnics. A parasol, Ravini whispered, thinking that was the right word, and it was. The girl twirled the parasol over her shoulder. She looked left, then she looked right, and then she looked up. For a breath, Ravini was sure she was looking straight at him, standing shirtless in his window. He gasped and stepped back, though he knew that if she was looking at his window, he'd already been seen. But then her gaze dropped, and the older boy reached up to take her hand, and she stepped down onto the street. The man closed the back of the truck and climbed into the cab, and then the truck lurched into motion and grumbled away into the night, leaving the 7 soundless children behind. Together, 6 of them walked up the path to the covered front porch of the empty house across the street. Only the girl with the parasol stayed behind. Ravini watched her standing alone on the sidewalk, and as he watched, she set her suitcase down. As she wiped at her cheeks with the back of her hand. First one, then the other. Ravini bit his lip. He knew that motion well. It didn't matter that the girl was 2 stories down and a street away, or that the only light came from the moon, or that her back was turned to him. The girl with the silver hair was wiping away tears, and he didn't need to see them to know it. The other 6 children climbed the porch steps and set their suitcases down, facing the front door. They reached out and grasped one another's hands. The oldest boy said something. His voice didn't reach across the street and up to the window, but his mouth was moving, his head turning from side to side. The 5 children beside him lowered their heads, then said something as well. Then they picked up their suitcase, opened the front door, and disappeared inside. Ravini blinked. Then his eyes went back to the girl with the parasol, and his heart jolted. She was standing in the moonlight, looking over her shoulder directly up at him. Ravini didn't know why he did what he did next. He wanted to hide, to duck behind the curtain. But there was something about the girl, about her silence, about how alone she stood there in the night, about her private tears. The story, like all stories, is about choices. And Ravini, in that moment, chose to not hide. Instead, he raised his hand in a silent wave. Sometimes, when 2 lonely souls find each other, there is a reaching out. The girl brought her own hand up, but not in a wave. She raised a single finger to her lips. She made no sound, but there was no mistaking what she was saying. Ravini's skin tingled. The night had a new flavor, danger. The girl lowered her hand. The older boy stalked out to the porch steps, his body tight and impatient. He cupped a hand around his mouth, and a sound echoed out, a sound like the hoot of an owl. The girl reached down and picked up her suitcase and then strolled up the walkway, the parasol twirling on her shoulder. When she reached the porch, she grabbed her wrist and pulled her inside. He grabbed her wrist and pulled her inside. The door closed, and the street stood empty once more. Ravini Foster stood in his window looking down on the moonlit street, his hand raised in a wave to a girl who came out of nowhere and then disappeared. The next morning, Ravini's mother stood in the brightness of the kitchen, drying dishes. Ravini smelled coffee and eggs and saw a plate waiting for him, but he walked past the table and into the dining room. "Good morning," his mother said. "Did you sleep all right?" "Yes," he said, looking out through the front window. Through the glass, he eyed the house across the street. It looked empty, dark. His stomach rumbled with hunger, but it was curiosity that gnawed at him. Had he really seen those midnight children arrive? Had it been a dream? Both seemed impossible. No bad dreams. He opened his mouth to answer his mother, to tell her about the truck and the children and the girl with the white umbrella. He remembered the ripple of danger he had felt. Surely he should tell his mother. But he also remembered a girl standing in the moonlit light, asking him to keep a secret without saying a word. And he remembered her silent tears. His mouth went dry, his stomach clenched, but he made a choice. "No, Mother," he said. "I slept sound all night." And that was chapter 1. So who are these mystery children? And did he make the right choice not to tell his mother about what he saw? Come back for chapter 2. It gets better.